Seattle at night stayed wet even when the rain paused, as if the city refused to dry completely. The asphalt shone under traffic lights and storefront neon, turning every crack into a dark seam. Glass towers near the waterfront watched the harbor without blinking, their windows reflecting moving headlights like a second city layered beneath the first. Wind from Elliott Bay carried salt, diesel, and cold metal, sliding through the streets with practiced certainty. Here, beauty did not soften danger. It disguised it. She returned under a different name, printed cleanly on documents that passed every verification. The new identity was built with precision and restraint, a modest apartment lease, a credit history that rose without spikes, academic credentials that drew no attention, photographs that looked ordinary enough to be forgotten. She had learned that the safest lies were dull, drama attracted curiosity, boredom survived scrutiny. Her real name had been buried with a family erased from public memory. 3 years earlier, an accident on Interstate 5 had been described as a multi-car pileup caused by rain and speed. The wording had been efficient. The case had closed quickly. In reports, the event was reduced to numbers and diagrams. In her body, it never closed. Gasoline burned in her throat when she breathed. Blood tasted metallic and sharp. Headlights cut across her vision at the wrong angle, too close, too deliberate. There was a moment of stillness between impacts when certainty settled in, colder than fear. This was not chance, it was intention. Her mother and younger sister died on that stretch of highway. Grief did not arrive as hysteria, it arrived as absence. The world kept moving while something essential vanished. Coffee still steamed. Cars still flowed. People still laughed. None of it aligned with the fact that 2 anchors of her life were gone. She survived because someone wanted her alive. That understanding stripped comfort from survival. Rescue became a transaction. In the weeks after the crash, her memory fractured into clean gaps. Pain, lights, then controlled voices and unfamiliar ceilings. Hands adjusted bandages without tenderness or cruelty. Later, she understood that what followed was not only treatment, it was management. They moved her. They rebuilt her face with the calm authority of specialists solving a problem. Swelling faded. Bruises dissolved. Symmetry settled into her bones like a fitted mask. When she looked in the mirror, she did not see a stranger. She saw evidence of money, influence, and planning. Throughout it all, the message was consistent. Forgetting was safer. Silence was practical. Grief distorted judgment. Life needed to move forward. The advice carried boundaries and warnings, reminders of what happened to people who insisted on reopening closed cases. She learned to nod, to appear grateful, to perform acceptance. She never forgot. She learned where to hide the truth. Her return to Seattle was quiet and deliberate. A gray afternoon, low clouds, a skyline blurred by mist. She left the airport with 1 bag and no urgency, checked into a hotel near the business district, paid in advance, left a paper trail that looked harmless. She did not call anyone from her past. Nostalgia made people careless. Her new position suited her, risk analyst. A title dry enough to conceal its purpose. The firm handled threats with human faces, extortion, leverage, reputational collapse. Its clients were people whose names sat on buildings and donor lists, people who valued security as much as power. The office reflected that ethos, polished surfaces, controlled air. No slogans. Discretion was not a virtue there. It was the product. The company belonged to Nathan Crawford. Publicly, he was a billionaire with a flawless resume. Boards, foundations, political committees. Magazine profiles framed him as disciplined and visionary. Privately, his name meant something else. People said he closed doors without noise. That problems around him vanished before becoming headlines. That he did not tolerate wasted investments. She did not meet him at the office. She saw him first at a closed charity event overlooking Puget Sound. Dark water beyond tall windows. Ferries sliding past like slow ghosts. The room smelled of wine and restrained perfume. Music filled silence rather than demanding attention. Conversations stayed low, laughter trimmed. At first, she did not see Crawford. Instead, she noticed the room adjusting around an absence. Conversations angled toward one corner. Security stiffened near a corridor. A subtle ring of space remained untouched, deliberate. He stood by the window, reflected city lights cutting thin lines across the glass. He did not perform warmth. He did not chase attention. His presence was contained, practiced, authoritative. People approached carefully, as if granted time rather than sharing it. Even the air respected his distance. She watched without starring, mapping alliances and behavior. Real estate men, legal intermediaries, portrait-related donors, the quiet machinery of power. When Crawford turned his head, their eyes met briefly. No surprise crossed his face. Only recognition, measured and calm, as if confirming something already known. She did not approach him. Desire invited mistakes. Leverage opened doors. She observed until the event ended, memorizing names, exits, security rhythms. Outside, the night was cold and damp. Lamps turned puddles into black glass. Cars moved with patient efficiency. She was crossing toward the pickup area when something broke the pattern. Shoes scraped wet pavement, too fast, too purposeful. A body collided with another. Heads turned, then turned away. Crawford stood near the edge of the parking structure, briefly separated from security. Two men approached him with rehearsed precision. Their posture was controlled. Their movements clean, professionals. Time narrowed to details. Wet concrete. Security reacting half a beat late. A flash of metal. Crawford turning without panic, as if violence were expected. She intervened without thinking about bravery. If Crawford died, her access died. Everything she had built collapsed. She cut across the open space, disrupting timing rather than seeking victory. Seconds mattered. Those seconds were enough. Security surged. Bodies collided. Commands stayed low. Someone hit the ground hard. Rain's smell mixed with sweat and metal. She was pinned under a harsh lamp, her wrist held in a controlled grip. Not punishment. Containment. Around them, the attackers were removed quickly, faces turned from cameras. The crowd retreated, eager to forget. Crawford approached her with measured steps. His expression was steady. His eyes assessed rather than thanked. He looked at the hand restraining her, then at her face, as if confirming a calculation. Under the lights, his calm felt unnerving. She held his gaze. Flinching invited conclusions. Her pulse hammered, a reminder of vulnerability. The city watched, indifferent. Seattle sold silence every day. Tonight it sold it again in the way nothing would be reported. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, reading the lines of her face, recognizing craftsmanship and cost. She understood then that her return had not gone unnoticed. She had stepped onto a board already in play. Rain began again, light and persistent. Traffic flowed endlessly on I-5 beyond the waterfront, headlights moving like a river that never stopped. She stood still as the city resumed its breathing, knowing the first real door had just closed behind her quietly, without ceremony. Seattle revealed its most deliberate beauty when danger settled in quietly. Rain thinned the air and absorbed sound, turning the city into a muted structure of movement and pauses. Streets became reflective corridors where light stretched and broke apart, and bridges stitched districts together like controlled passages designed for observation rather than freedom. From above, the city looked open and fluid. From within, it behaved like a system that remembered every step taken inside it. She was relocated to one of Crawford's properties under the language of protection. The decision came quickly, efficiently, wrapped in the neutral tone of logistics rather than concern. The building stood near the water, its facade all glass and steel, designed to suggest transparency while enforcing distance. Entry points required layered authorization. Elevators recognized credentials before movement. Hallways erased sound so completely that footsteps felt internal, as if she were moving through her own thoughts rather than space. The architecture was not hostile. It was precise. Inside, the apartment carried no personality. Furniture was chosen for balance and restraint, surfaces cleared of anything that could anchor memory. The windows framed Seattle as an image rather than an environment, the city distant enough to watch without participating. Cameras were present, discreet and intelligently placed, never confronting, always implied. Guards rotated with irregular consistency, ensuring familiarity never turned into comfort. Schedules were suggestions that hardened into expectations. It was safety constructed by someone who understood that control functioned best when it did not announce itself. She recognized the intent immediately. This was not hospitality, and it was not imprisonment. It was containment designed to feel voluntary. Crawford never confronted her. He did not ask why she had been there that night, did not question her timing or her competence. Instead, he shaped circumstances. He adjusted access points, altered routines, observed which boundaries she tested and which she respected. Silence became his instrument. In that silence, information surfaced through posture, decision-making, restraint. He allowed her to reveal herself without forcing disclosure. She understood that he did not believe in coincidence. Her intervention had been too precise, too calm, too costly to dismiss as impulse. And yet he kept her close, allowed her visibility, placed her within his perimeter rather than removing her from it. That decision unsettled her. Open hostility would have been simpler. Proximity implied calculation, and calculation required intent. The second threat emerged quietly, as these things always did. Grayson Pike's name surfaced where it should not have. It appeared in procurement chains reviewed as routine. It lingered in Port Authority filings attached to shell companies with no operational history. It connected to redevelopment projects that intersected only through secondary contractors and logistical services. Pike was the inheritor of an old construction empire that had survived regulation by dissolving into fragments. His influence moved through unions, transport firms, demolition crews, and disposal services that specialized in removing evidence as efficiently as waste. His people carried no insignia. They were recognized through pattern rather than appearance, the way they occupied space, the way they exited rooms without explanation. The city registered them instinctively, like weather changes that arrived without warning. Pike himself rarely appeared in contexts that mattered. He preferred distance, allowing outcomes to speak while he remained abstract. The connection to the I-5 crash was indirect by design. It lived in margins and amendments. A subcontractor authorized to move equipment on a night when no movement was scheduled. A disposal invoice revised after submission. A temporary traffic control permit issued under an unrelated project code. Each detail alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a narrative that refused to disappear. There was another layer, more intimate and more dangerous. Pike's name had surfaced during her disappearance, spoken by people who framed intervention as help. Assistance that arrived too quickly, resources that asked no questions, solutions that demanded silence as payment. She had been passed through systems that understood logistics intimately, and Pike's world thrived on logistics of every kind. She decided to act before the structure closed around her. The maneuver was calculated and narrow. She released partial information regarding a redevelopment tender involving an abandoned dock facility. The project's value lay not in immediate profit, but in what it enabled: control over shipping routes, zoning exceptions, regulatory blind spots. The leak appeared to originate from competing bidders, incomplete enough to be believable, detailed enough to provoke response. It suggested that Crawford's firm had secured advantage through quiet political alignment. It was bait designed to trigger urgency. She expected Pike to react by accelerating his channels, by leaning on intermediaries to counter a perceived threat. Speed created exposure. Exposure revealed hierarchy. She needed him to show who insulated him when pressure arrived. Crawford won the tender. The victory arrived without noise. Approvals aligned too cleanly. Reviews moved too smoothly. Anyone with experience understood that such success invited retaliation. In Seattle, losses were not confronted directly. They were dissolved through erosion. That erosion began immediately. Rumors surfaced in controlled fragments. Commentary questioned Crawford's judgment, focusing on the woman suddenly visible beside him. Articles implied impropriety without committing to accusation. Anonymous sources framed her as liability. Her presence became a lever. And the lever worked. Her medical history, buried beneath layers of reconstruction and documentation, became a target. Records not meant to exist resurfaced in distorted forms. Whispers of cosmetic surgery were paired with insinuations of instability. Discipline was reframed as fragility. Weakness, even suggested, carried currency in negotiations built on dominance. Crawford did not respond publicly. He absorbed pressure quietly, mapping its origin while adjusting internal strategy. In private spaces, she noticed details that unsettled her. In his residence, she encountered archived materials that did not belong to casual curiosity. Old financial reports, legal analyses tied to closed cases, printed articles about the I-5 crash, preserved not as news but as reference. They were stored with care, categorized like assets rather than memories. The implication was unavoidable. Crawford had been aware of the crash long before her return. Awareness did not equal guilt, but it suggested proximity. It suggested that he had been watching from somewhere closer than she expected. She began to question whether his involvement was peripheral or structural. Despite the risk, he did not remove her. He did not isolate her further or erase her presence. He kept her positioned where she could be seen, protected enough to survive, but exposed enough to draw pressure away from more vulnerable points. It was a strategic choice, one that treated her not as possession, but as complication. That choice disturbed her more than hostility ever could. Hatred followed predictable rules. Care from a man who measured lives in leverage did not. It forced her to consider that she was no longer the sole architect of manipulation. That someone else was allowing the game to continue because it served an objective larger than revenge. At night, the city pressed against the glass, lights smearing across water like unresolved thoughts. She existed between protection and captivity, leverage and exposure, aware that the deal forming around her had never been spoken. It existed in shared understanding, in the silence where neither side stepped back. Seattle did not require contracts written in ink. Recognition was enough. And in the dark, recognition was already binding. The scandal was engineered with restraint, which made it more effective than any public outburst. It unfolded slowly, with deliberate spacing, as if its architects understood that outrage burned out too quickly while suspicion lingered. The first images surfaced without context. Her figure near the entrance of a private medical clinic, partially obscured by rain and glass. A second frame showed her reflected in a window beside Crawford, their proximity exaggerated by angle and cropping. The photographs were never sharp enough to be definitive, never crude enough to provoke denial. They invited interpretation, and the city obliged. Headlines followed a familiar pattern. They avoided accusations and relied on suggestion. Language framed her as recent, sudden, undefined. Crawford's name appeared beside hers often enough to imply correlation. Commentators speculated about compromised judgment, blurred professional boundaries, emotional risk inside corporate leadership. In Seattle, where silence was a commodity traded long before it was needed, visibility functioned as sabotage. Public attention disrupted agreements that had been built quietly and carefully. Reputation here behaved like an ecosystem. Once disturbed, it did not collapse immediately. It reacted. Investors hesitated. Political allies paused. Doors that had always opened began to require explanation. The narrative was not meant to destroy Crawford outright. It was meant to loosen the structure around him, to make him appear exposed, distracted, human in ways that weakened his leverage. She understood this logic well. She had used it herself in other cities, under other names. What unsettled her was how precisely she had been positioned within it. The first calculated move to separate her from Crawford did not come through force or intimidation. It came through Evelyn Rose. Evelyn entered the situation without visible confrontation. Her arrival registered through adjustments rather than announcements. Calendars shifted. Invitations were redirected. Meetings that had been informal suddenly required approval. Evelyn was the daughter of a senator whose influence had survived decades not through visibility, but through alignment. Her family did not seize power. They curated it. Her presence represented continuity, the kind that reassured donors, lobbyists, and board members that nothing unpredictable would be allowed to take root. Evelyn's public persona was composed, elegant, carefully neutral. She spoke in measured intervals. She listened more than she spoke. Her value lay not in aggression, but in inevitability. She embodied a future that had already been discussed in rooms where outcomes were framed as responsible decisions rather than personal desires. She did not challenge her openly. She did not need to. Territory in this world was marked through omission. Introductions were delayed until they lost relevance. Names were excluded from conversations that mattered. She found herself present but unacknowledged, visible yet undefined. The message was unmistakable. She was not meant to remain. Evelyn's approach was not cruelty. It was administration. Pressure followed methodically. Financial institutions reopened reviews on accounts that had been accepted without question. Background checks resurfaced with renewed interest. Social intermediaries reframed her presence as instability, as a temporary distraction in Crawford's otherwise disciplined life. The intent was to strip her of legitimacy without direct confrontation, to reduce her to an anomaly that could be corrected quietly. Crawford observed, without reacting publicly. This was consistent with his nature. He did not counter narratives head-on. He absorbed them, measured their trajectory, adjusted internal positioning. He neither defended her nor distanced himself from her. His refusal to clarify unsettled everyone involved. To those accustomed to swift correction, ambiguity read as weakness. To those who understood power, it suggested calculation. She began to see him more clearly through the pressure. Nathan Crawford did not project dominance through volume or display. His authority came from absence of hesitation. He moved through the city as if it responded to him instinctively, as if systems adjusted themselves in anticipation of his needs. He did not rush. He did not react emotionally. When decisions were made, they appeared inevitable in retrospect, as though no alternative had ever existed. What disturbed her was not his control, but his restraint. He did not attempt to extract explanations from her. He did not press her to justify her presence. He allowed uncertainty to exist between them, which suggested that he already understood more than he admitted. The escalation came when subtlety failed. Pike's people moved without warning. There was no negotiation, no attempt at leverage. This was not about exchange. It was about degradation. In a city where authority depended on respect, humiliation functioned as execution. The objective was not to kill her. It was to dismantle her position so completely that survival would become irrelevant. The place was selected for efficiency, anonymous, temporary, a space that had been repurposed too many times to retain identity. Concrete surfaces absorbed sound unevenly. The air carried the faint trace of chemicals and dampness. She cataloged it immediately, not emotionally but mechanically. Dimensions, angles, sound behavior. The body responded faster than thought. Fear arrived, sharp and immediate, but it did not paralyze her. Fear refined her attention. She had learned long ago that memory could be unreliable. Trauma rearranged timelines, softened edges, erased detail. The body did not. The body remembered pressure, restraint, impact. It remembered how time fractured under pain, how opportunity appeared briefly and vanished if not seized. She did not wait. She did not plead. She observed. Her survival did not come from hope. It came from discipline. When Crawford arrived, he did not arrive as a rescuer. He arrived as someone who recognized escalation and responded accordingly. His movements were controlled, economical, almost impersonal. He did not dramatize the violence. He ended it. The confrontation was brief, decisive, and final in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. He was injured in the process. The wound was abrupt and real. Blood on his hands, on the floor, an intrusion of consequence that refused abstraction. For the first time, the situation escaped the language of strategy and entered the territory of irreversible outcome. The hospital erased time. Light was too bright, air too sterile. Machines translated his body into numbers and probabilities. She watched through glass, aware that her presence there destabilized everything she had planned. He survived. The surgery succeeded. Risk retreated into controlled margins. What followed unsettled her, more than the violence. He did not withdraw. He did not reduce contact or retreat behind protocol. He remained present, not as reassurance, not as possession, but as continuity. It was not tenderness. It was refusal to disengage, as if stepping back would concede something he was unwilling to lose. For the first time, her internal architecture faltered. She had accounted for leverage, for access, for loss. She had believed detachment would protect her from hesitation. Instead, she encountered a fact that arrived without drama or metaphor. She did not want him to die. The realization was not romantic. It was structural. His absence would alter the system in ways she could not calculate. Paths would close, variables would shift. That awareness destabilized her more than fear ever had. Pike intensified pressure immediately. Messages arrived indirectly, embedded in events rather than words. Contracts collapsed without explanation. Associates vanished from circulation. Incidents aligned with unnerving precision. The implication threaded through each disruption was unmistakable. He knew who she was. He knew the crash had been orchestrated. And he knew that Crawford's awareness extended further than he admitted. The suggestion was deliberate. Pike framed Crawford not as protector, but as participant. Someone who had benefited from the aftermath. Someone who may have allowed events to unfold because they served his interests. The narrative was designed to corrode trust rather than confront it. By the end of the chapter, certainty did not arrive. Understanding did. She was no longer facing a single adversary. Power in Seattle did not operate through singular figures. It functioned through overlapping claims, through entitlement masked as inevitability. Pike believed she belonged to the narrative he had shaped. Evelyn believed she was an obstacle to a future already decided. And Crawford, whether consciously or not, had integrated her into a structure that placed her at its center. What unsettled her most was not the danger. It was the realization that each of them believed they had a right to her existence. And her body, remembering what her mind still resisted, warned her that the cost of that belief would soon be collected. She chose publicity not as defiance and not as belief in justice, but as a maneuver forced by exhaustion of quieter paths. In the United States, truth rarely moved in a straight line. It was filtered, delayed, traded, diluted through committees, courts, and private settlements until it no longer threatened anyone who mattered. Silence was not simply preferred by systems like Seattle's. Silence was the default outcome, the natural resting state of power. For years, she had survived by respecting that logic. Now it had turned against her. Remaining unseen had become more dangerous than exposure. She stepped into the public record under her real name, knowing that once spoken aloud it could no longer be safely erased. The press conference was assembled with clinical restraint. No symbolic backdrop, no dramatic architecture, no attempt to wrap the moment in moral language. The room was administrative, fluorescent lit, forgettable by design. Cameras lined the walls like instruments rather than witnesses. Reporters arrived prepared for scandal, not for precision. When she entered, attention sharpened without emotion. Her name, long absent from circulation, was spoken again, typed into headlines, logged into archives that did not forget. She stated her intent without ornament or appeal. She announced the reopening of the investigation into the I-5 crash. She declared her legal claim to her family's assets, assets that had been absorbed quietly after their deaths. She confirmed that documentation had already been prepared for federal review and that the matter would not remain under local discretion. She offered no timeline and no reassurance. The absence of visible grief unsettled the room. It disrupted the narrative reporters expected to frame. She did not perform trauma. She asserted presence. For the city, the announcement sounded like a direct challenge to an ecosystem that survived on quiet consensus. For Grayson Pike, it was an unmistakable declaration of war stripped of symbolism. For Evelyn Rose, it threatened a future already outlined in private agreements. For Nathan Crawford, it marked a point of no return. He understood better than anyone how quickly witnesses vanished once the balance shifted, how efficiently pressure could be applied when justification already existed. The response did not wait for reaction cycles. Within hours, documents surfaced through anonymous channels, released with precision that suggested preparation rather than improvisation. Corporate records appeared linking her name to irregular transactions within a port labor union she had never worked for directly. Fabricated contracts implied involvement in illegal logistics, schemes tied to environmental violations and customs evasion. Public relations firms seeded commentary framing her return as performance, as manipulation, as an attempt to leverage sympathy into financial recovery. The language avoided accusations. It relied on implication and repetition. The goal was erosion, not refutation. At the same time, Pike initiated a purge designed to collapse the scaffolding of testimony before it could be assembled. Contractors who had handled roadside repairs near the crash site closed operations overnight. Independent drivers who had worked irregular routes suddenly relocated or disappeared from registries. A mechanic known for discreet vehicle disposal vanished from licensing databases, property records, and union rosters. These were not prominent figures. They were connective tissue. Their removal created absences that could not be reconstructed. This was not defensive strategy. It was preemptive erasure. Crawford responded by abandoning restraint he had maintained for years. He did not attempt to distance himself from her publicly. He did not issue calming statements or seek to contain the narrative through intermediaries. Instead, he accelerated a process that had clearly existed long before her return. His actions carried the confidence of someone who had already mapped the terrain. Secure archives were opened. Analysts were reassigned without explanation. Financial trails marked dormant were reopened under new assumptions. He moved with purpose, not reaction. Names surfaced that had never appeared together in public documents. Payment chains revealed deliberate fragmentation designed to obscure origin and accountability. Insurance claims aligned across unrelated incidents, exploiting identical regulatory loopholes. Police reports were cross-referenced with internal memoranda that contradicted official conclusions. What emerged was not opportunistic corruption. It was orchestration layered over time. Watching this unfold, she realized something more unsettling than Pike's aggression. Crawford had not begun investigating after her return. He had been observing long before she re-entered the city. What he had lacked was not access or suspicion. It had been standing. Without her name, without her claim, the case remained theoretical, vulnerable to dismissal as coincidence or rivalry. Her return transformed suspicion into obligation. It provided a victim who could no longer be erased quietly. The most dangerous development arrived from an unexpected direction. A corrupted data fragment surfaced, preserved not out of loyalty but self-interest. A partial recording from a traffic camera believed destroyed during the original review. The footage was degraded, fragmented, damaged by time and mishandling. Yet its existence alone altered the balance. It proved not what happened, but what had been removed. Restoration was possible, but it required time, specialized resources, and uninterrupted access. Time was the one resource they did not possess. Pike reacted immediately. Surveillance intensified around her. Routes became unreliable. Locations previously considered secure were compromised within hours. The city's infrastructure, designed to streamline movement and transaction, now functioned as a narrowing funnel. The next attempt to remove her came without disguise. Vehicles followed openly. Pressure was applied in public spaces rather than hidden ones. Pike no longer feared exposure. He believed momentum favored him. He believed Crawford would not risk direct confrontation with political alliances already destabilized. That assumption failed. Crawford crossed a boundary he had spent years reinforcing. He severed channels previously treated as untouchable. Political considerations were deprioritized in favor of operational certainty. Resources were deployed not to manage fallout, but to neutralize threats. His response was not emotional. It was corrective. He acted as someone who recognized that rules only mattered while they still functioned. The counteraction unfolded rapidly. Emergency filings froze assets across interconnected entities. Transportation nodes were closed under regulatory pretexts, immune to immediate appeal. Pike's intermediaries were exposed simultaneously, each move triggering consequences in parallel systems. The speed eliminated adjustment. The city's mechanisms of concealment were repurposed into instruments of isolation. The cost surfaced quickly. Crawford's public position weakened. Long-standing alliances recalibrated. Evelyn's network withdrew with calculated distance, reframing the situation as unfortunate but unavoidable. The political future she represented adjusted around new variables. She did not vanish, but her inevitability fractured. She remained visible, not because she had prevailed, but because she had not been silenced. Her name, returned to circulation through exposure sharpened by threat, no longer belonged to memory. It carried weight forged through consequence. She understood that the price of that weight would continue to rise. What changed was not the danger. It was the configuration of power. By choosing visibility, she had forced the conflict into a space where it could no longer be resolved quietly. The knife that returned her name had cut deeper than secrecy. It had severed the assumption that control would remain centralized. In a city that sold silence, that rupture could not be repaired. Pike made his move without ambiguity. It was not disguised as negotiation, nor softened by intermediaries. He took a hostage because hostages simplified the equation. He chose his target with care, selecting not the most visible ally Crawford had, but the most structurally important one. The man was old, deliberate, almost invisible in public narratives. A senior legal partner who had spent decades constructing compliant frameworks around unstable capital. He was the keeper of originals, contracts that predated digital replication, handwritten amendments, notarized documents whose physical existence still mattered in courtrooms that pretended to function on principle. He represented Crawford's final bridge to legality, the thin line separating preparation from prosecution. At the same time, Pike built a second structure around her. It was not a single location, not a simple abduction. It was a funnel, routes closed. Vehicles appeared and disappeared at the edges of vision. Familiar streets became unreliable. The city, already hostile, reorganized itself into pressure points. Pike did not intend to isolate her physically at first. He intended to force alignment, to make her proximity to Crawford the lever that would crush him. The message was clear without being delivered directly. Crawford would be allowed one choice: save the woman who had destabilized everything, or preserve the possibility of dismantling Pike's empire through law. One life or the future, emotion or structure, weakness or power. Seattle entered a suspended state. In those hours, the city felt emptied of incidental noise. Traffic under the overpasses thinned. Parking structures became hollow chambers where footsteps echoed too loudly. Warehouses near the port closed early, their steel doors sealing with dull finality. Freight elevators stalled between levels, smelling of rust, oil, and salt carried in from the bay. Even the water seemed still, reflecting lights without distortion, as if holding its breath. There was no space for heroism in that stillness, only consequence. Crawford understood the shape of the trap immediately. Pike wanted him visible, broken in a way that would travel fast. The spectacle mattered. Pike needed the city to see that even someone insulated by wealth, political capital, and procedural legitimacy could be forced to kneel when emotion entered the equation. He wanted Crawford to choose publicly, to demonstrate that attachment was always the flaw power could exploit. Crawford went where Pike expected him to go. He did not arrive with an entourage. He did not bring negotiators or signals of compliance. He carried evidence instead, fragmented deliberately, enough to confirm its existence without revealing its full scope. It was bait refined by experience. He knew Pike would not resist the opportunity to see what threatened him. He also knew that once the documents were acknowledged, even briefly, they became harder to erase completely. The location was one Pike favored for such encounters: a closed logistics hub near the water, far enough from residential zones to discourage witnesses, close enough to the port to dissolve into routine movement. The air inside was cold and damp, thick with the smell of metal and stagnant water. Light sources were harsh and uneven, creating pockets of shadow that swallowed detail. It was a place designed for leverage, not dialogue. Crawford walked into it, knowing exactly what was expected of him. Pike wanted capitulation, a retreat framed as pragmatism, a decision presented as responsible leadership rather than surrender. Crawford was supposed to exchange the future for the present, legality for survival, structure for sentiment. Pike did not believe Crawford capable of doing otherwise. Power, in Pike's mind, was always transactional, and transactions always favored the one willing to be crueler. What Pike underestimated was Crawford's relationship to loss. Crawford did not beg. He did not argue. He allowed the pressure to accumulate, allowed Pike's confidence to expand into carelessness. He understood that breaking power rarely came from resistance alone. It came from misalignment between expectation and outcome. While Pike focused on Crawford, the city continued to move around her. She understood that she was not the centerpiece of the trap, She was its justification. Pike expected her to be recovered or destroyed as a consequence of Crawford's choice. He expected her to remain reactive. That assumption was his first mistake. She did not wait for extraction. She had spent years being managed, hidden, repositioned by forces that treated her as material rather than agency. That phase ended when Pike made her the currency of his ultimatum. In that moment, she recognized the final shape of her role and rejected it entirely. Her movement through the city was deliberate and unspectacular. She avoided routes that suggested urgency. She blended into patterns rather than breaking them. Public transit, pedestrian flow, service corridors inside buildings designed to move staff rather than attention. Her body guided her more than planning did. It remembered how danger compressed time, how survival depended on reducing variables. She reached the periphery of Pike's operation, not as a hostage to be reclaimed, but as a factor unaccounted for. Inside the logistics hub, pressure escalated. Pike tightened his grip on the legal partner, using proximity and degradation rather than overt violence. The message was not cruelty for its own sake. It was demonstration. Crawford was meant to see what happened to structures that relied on compliance. The man represented process, continuity, the illusion that legality could still function within corrupted systems. Breaking him symbolically meant breaking the future he protected. Crawford absorbed it without reaction. He knew Pike wanted an emotional response. He refused to provide it. Instead, he recalculated. He adjusted the offer, shifting what he revealed and what he withheld. The evidence he carried became both shield and threat, calibrated to keep Pike engaged but uncertain. And then she intervened, not by entering the confrontation, but by collapsing its premise. She redirected Pike's attention elsewhere, triggering consequences he could not immediately contain. Information moved, not through the channels Pike controlled, but through ones he had ignored as irrelevant. Documentation duplicated and transmitted in fragments that made no sense individually, but formed coherence when assembled elsewhere. She did not give Pike what he wanted. She gave him something he could not use fast enough. By refusing to play the role of victim, she turned the hostage scenario into a liability. Pike realized too late that the choice he had constructed was false. Crawford was no longer choosing between her life and the case. The case had already moved beyond the room. Authority was no longer centralized. The city was no longer the final arbiter. The confrontation ended without resolution. Crawford did not secure a clean victory. He did not rescue the situation in a way that could be framed as triumph. The legal partner was released damaged but alive. A compromise Pike could still rationalize as leverage preserved rather than lost. Crawford left without reclaiming dominance. What he reclaimed was possibility. They did not leave together as heroes. They left as survivors who understood that the next phase would be worse. Pike had been exposed but not dismantled. His methods would grow more direct, less restrained by reputation. The remaining alliances would fracture unpredictably. Violence would no longer be implied. It would be used. As they moved back into the city's muted flow, she understood the full weight of her decision. She had stepped out of the role designed for her. She had refused to be the justification for someone else's power. That refusal carried cost. The most dangerous part lay ahead. Presenting evidence to authorities beyond the city's reach meant confronting institutions that pretended neutrality while protecting themselves. Surviving long enough for the truth to be heard required more than strategy. It required endurance against systems that did not forgive disruption. Seattle resumed its breathing around them, indifferent and intact. Lights reflected off wet pavement. The port continued its operations. From a distance, nothing appeared altered. But something fundamental had shifted. Power had been forced to choose, and in choosing, it had revealed its limits. The restoration did not begin as a triumph. It began as an inventory of damage. The recording arrived like a relic that had been handled too many times by hands that did not care what it meant, only what it could buy. It had been copied, compressed, exported, renamed, hidden inside unrelated folders, written onto cheap storage, moved through pockets and drawers and safe boxes with the same indifference that people used when they wanted something to survive, but also wanted plausible ignorance. Every transfer had shaved off clarity. Every conversion had introduced new scars. The file did not look like proof. It looked like a tired, corrupted fragment of an old night that Seattle had already agreed to forget. Crawford treated it as if it were fragile bone. He did not leave it in the custody of anyone who spoke too loudly about certainty. He did not hand it to local technicians whose livelihoods depended on city contracts. He had spent years building a private spine of capability, people who worked outside public reputations, specialists who did not require social approval, analysts who understood that the most valuable truths were the ones that had been partially destroyed. He brought the fragment to them through a chain of custody that resembled a military transfer more than an investigation. Every movement was logged, duplicated, sealed, moved again, duplicated again. He behaved like a man who had always expected this moment, and like a man who feared it. She watched from the edge of the process, not because she was excluded, but because proximity made her breathing uneven. The evidence was not abstract to her. It was not a case file, not an argument, not a political weapon. It was the closest thing to a time machine she would ever touch. It was the chance to look at the night that had been rewritten into bureaucracy and finally see it without human narration. She had built her return on hunger for that clarity, yet when it was placed in front of her, her body reacted before her mind did. Her hands went cold. Her jaw tightened until it hurt. Her pulse moved like something trapped. The specialists worked without romance. They did not speak about justice. They spoke about codecs, noise profiles, frame continuity, timestamp drift. They treated the recording as an artifact to be reconstructed, not a story to be believed. They stabilized the motion first, stripping away the jitter that came from cheap sensors and later compression. They corrected exposure across frames so that headlight flares did not erase the edges of vehicles. They recovered metadata fragments buried in file structure, pieces of time that survived because someone had not known how to remove them cleanly. They aligned it with other sources. Traffic control logs, weather archives, a set of adjacent municipal feeds that had not been scrubbed because no one had thought to look. The recording began to breathe again, not as a dramatic reveal, but as a sequence of dull, physical facts returning to coherence. The road appeared as it had been, wet, reflective, turning every light into a knife. The lanes were ordinary. The vehicles were ordinary. The night was ordinary. That ordinariness was what made it unbearable. It meant the crash did not happen in a special world. It happened in the same world people drove through every day. And then the structure of intent became visible. A cargo truck drifted with controlled precision, not the lazy wander of fatigue. It adjusted once, the kind of correction that suggested practice. Another vehicle entered the frame at the wrong time, in the wrong position, accelerating into a gap that should have remained safe. The maneuver was small enough to be missed by anyone who wanted to miss it, yet coherent enough that once seen, it could not be unseen. The second vehicle forced the chain reaction. The truck became the blade. The other car became the hand. The recording did not contain voices. It did not contain orders. It did not contain a confession. It contained geometry. She stared at the screen as if she could will it to change. She expected, irrationally, that memory would argue with it, that her mind would insist it was not the same night. But the rain pattern matched what her skin remembered. The way the asphalt shone matched the image behind her eyelids for years. The angle of the lights matched the moment she had always described as a cut across her vision. Her throat tightened with something that was not grief exactly, because grief required space, and she had lived too long without space. What she felt was recognition, brutal and clean. Crawford did not look away. He stood behind the specialists, hands still, expression controlled, the kind of control that did not mean calm but discipline. He had always carried himself like someone used to influence, steady posture, measured movement, eyes that made decisions without showing the process. In that room, the mask thinned. He was not emotional in a visible way, but his attention sharpened into something almost predatory. The moment proof became real, his patience became something else. Strategy stopped being theory and became execution. The next step was not the video itself. The next step was what the video made undeniable. Once the geometry existed, the financial trail could be treated differently. Before, it was a field of suspicious patterns. Now it was a map with a starting point. Analysts built timelines around the night, then pulled records that touched that timeline like fingerprints. Tow truck contracts, after-hours roadway service invoices, environmental cleanup charges filed through third-party vendors that did not advertise publicly. Small payments that looked harmless alone, then repeated with unnatural consistency across different projects. The names that emerged were not cinematic villains. They were companies with respectable branding. A security subcontractor whose office was a mailbox in a different state. A logistics service with a polished website and no real employees. An equipment disposal firm that specialized in urgent recovery, charging premium rates for quiet work at inconvenient hours. The patterns pointed back to Pike's world immediately. The same contractors, the same paperwork style, the same insurance partners. Pike's empire had been built on concrete and steel, but its real strength was the network of compliance. People who did not ask questions, because asking questions interrupted profit. As the trail expanded, it climbed. Insurance companies appeared in the chain not as passive bystanders, but as instruments. Claims were filed with a specificity that suggested cooperation. Adjusters were assigned repeatedly to incidents connected to Pike's projects. Legal settlements were drafted in identical language, as if one template had been used to bury multiple truths. The paper was clean in the way dirty systems always were. It used legality as soap. Then the trail widened into the city's social bloodstream. Donations surfaced, fragmented across charities and development initiatives. Funds moved through foundations with names that suggested civic virtue, public safety, youth sports, waterfront revitalization. Political donors connected to Pike's circle had funded campaigns while speaking about transparency. Board members who preached ethics had approved zoning exceptions that made Pike richer. None of it proved murder by itself. It proved something more corrosive, an environment where murder could be operationalized and then hidden inside normal business. Crawford had anticipated this layer. She began to understand how long he had been preparing and what kind of loneliness preparation required. He had built his public image on legitimacy, the billionaire, president of boards, the man of committees, the figure who stabilized risk for powerful clients. But beneath that role, he had been constructing a mechanism that did not rely on Seattle's permission. He had been gathering fragments, documenting inconsistencies, storing originals. Not because he believed the city would reward him for it, because he understood the city would punish him if he did not. His power had never been purely financial. It had been architectural. He knew which doors opened with money and which only opened with leverage. He knew which people could be bought and which had to be cornered. He had watched men like Pike thrive on the assumption that every authority could be negotiated with. He had prepared an answer that could not be negotiated locally. When the evidence became dense enough, he activated that answer. He did not go to city police. He did not go to the district attorney whose election depended on donors. He did not go to the councils whose meetings were public theater. He bypassed Seattle as if Seattle were not real authority at all. He transferred the package through federal channels, not as rumor, not as accusation, but as a structured case. Footage, metadata, transaction maps, sworn declarations from reluctant witnesses, the chain of custody documented down to minutes. Federal agencies did not arrive with Seattle's manners. They arrived with impatience. Their presence altered the atmosphere of the city in a way that money could not. People who had been comfortable suddenly became cautious. Office staff began shredding documents too late. Lawyers stopped answering calls. Executives booked flights and then canceled them. A kind of silent panic spread, not visible on streets but present in the way schedules shifted and meetings moved to secure locations. Arrests did not happen like scenes in films. They happened like maintenance. One contractor was taken from a workplace that smelled of oil and damp wood. Another was taken from a suburban home whose lawn had been kept perfect by someone who believed neatness could protect him. A third was stopped while driving, pulled over by vehicles with no flashy lights, just federal authority that did not need performance. Charges were layered, not simply about the crash but about the network. Fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, obstruction. The system began collapsing from multiple angles. Pike responded with the only tool he trusted: noise. He flooded the city with narrative contamination designed to confuse, distract, exhaust. Anonymous briefings framed Crawford as manipulative, claiming he manufactured evidence to eliminate a competitor. Leaks implied that the woman beside him was an asset, a planted vulnerability used to justify hostility. Old photographs were repurposed into insinuation. Medical records appeared, selectively edited, suggesting instability. Rumors were seeded about her identity, her history, her real motives. The strategy was not to win in court. It was to poison the perception of everyone involved so thoroughly that even truth would feel like a factional weapon. He aimed for Crawford's reputation, because reputation was how Seattle functioned. A person without reputation became expendable. She felt that pressure in the way strangers' eyes lingered too long, in the sudden appearance of unfamiliar cars near places she passed through, in the subtle shift among people who had once treated her as invisible, but now treated her as a rumor. Pike's machine understood the city's psychology. It did not need to kill her immediately if it could make her socially dead first. But the case did not depend on social approval anymore. The evidence was heavy. The footage was blunt in its ordinariness. The financial trail was too coherent. Witnesses, once protected by the assumption they would never be asked, began cooperating when they realized they would be held responsible either way. Pike's associates started turning not because they developed conscience, but because survival demanded it. The network that had operated on mutual secrecy began devouring itself. Pike attempted to leave. He did not flee like a man in fear. He fled like a man who believed he still controlled time. Flight plans shifted. Vehicles moved. A route was planned through a private airfield. Cash was repositioned. Assets were transferred in anticipation of disruption. He believed he could disappear and rebuild somewhere else because men like him always believed they could rebuild. He underestimated how quickly a mechanism could close when it no longer answered to local rules. His departure stalled in bureaucratic friction that no amount of money resolved in time. Accounts froze across jurisdictions. Properties were seized. A few key allies, desperate to protect themselves, gave up information that tightened the net. In the end, Pike was not taken in a dramatic chase. He was caught in the plainness of procedure, surrounded by authority that did not need him. His arrest did not feel like justice to her. It felt like a correction in a machine that never apologized. Seattle reacted the way Seattle always did. It expressed shock, then rearranged itself. Public statements about commitment and transparency appeared. Committees were formed. Leaders promised reform. Corporate boards replaced a few faces and preserved the rest. Donors shifted to safer candidates. The city did not collapse. It adapted. It changed the signage and kept the structure. She saw that clearly, and it did not break her. She had not returned for the city's moral awakening. She had returned for her own. The legal restoration of her name was slow and dry. It moved through courts and documents, through signatures and filings, through the sterile language of ownership transfer and identity correction. Her name returned to records first, then to accounts, then to properties. Each step felt less like victory and more like reclaiming a stolen object that did not feel clean anymore. She could hold it, but it carried residue. It carried years. The name did not heal her. It did not bring back her mother. It did not bring back her sister. It did not erase the years spent living under another identity, with another face, with her body treated as an editable surface. But the name gave her position. It gave her standing. It gave her the ability to exist without permission. That mattered. Crawford's world did not remain intact. He kept influence, but his influence changed texture. Certain alliances frayed beyond repair. Some doors no longer opened automatically. People who had once praised him publicly now treated him with cautious distance, not because they hated him, but because they feared proximity to disruption. He became a man associated with consequences rather than comfort, and Seattle preferred comfort. He accepted that cost without theatrics. She began to understand what he had sacrificed and what he had protected. He had chosen to act outside the city's polite corruption. He had chosen to expose systems that benefited him too, even if indirectly. He had chosen her, not as a romantic gesture, but as a refusal to let the city decide who deserved survival. It did not make him soft. It made him dangerous in a different way. Their bond remained unsentimental. There were no declarations, no promises framed as an easy future. What existed between them was a quiet agreement forged under pressure. Recognition of what the other had endured, recognition of what power demanded, recognition that survival was not the same as happiness but could still be meaningful. They did not pretend the night had ended. They did not pretend scars were temporary. They moved forward with clarity instead of illusion. In the weeks after the arrests, she found herself walking again through Seattle's rain. The city remained what it was, wet sidewalks reflecting neon and office lights, glass towers standing indifferent beside the water, alleyways that smelled of damp concrete and old garbage, bridges that made the city feel like a network of corridors rather than a home. Rain continued to fall as if it had always owned the sky. But the rain did not feel like a sentence anymore. It became background. She still carried memory in her body, but memory no longer controlled every breath. She could stand under an overpass and hear the water dripping from beams without translating it into danger. She could pass headlights on wet asphalt without feeling her vision cut open. The proof had not erased the past, but it had anchored it. It had given shape to what had been gaslighted into doubt. It had allowed her to stop arguing with her own mind. Crawford watched her with the same controlled attention he brought to everything, but the quality of it changed. Not warmer, not sentimental, simply more present. Less strategic, more honest. He remained what he was, a man built from discipline and calculation, with power that functioned like gravity. Yet he had made a choice that had broken a certain kind of power, the kind that depended on silence and the belief that everyone could be bent. The evidence had survived the rain. And because it had survived, something else survived too. Not innocence, not purity, not a clean ending. Possibility. In Seattle, possibility was rare. It was not celebrated. It was not given freely. It had to be taken, held, defended. She held it quietly. The city continued breathing around her, indifferent and intact. The night did not disappear. It never truly did. But for the first time in years, she felt that she could live inside it without being owned by it. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.